Snow still clung stubbornly to the old gods with stones, though summer had been declared by ravens. A trick of the north and its memory for winters that never quite ended. John stood beneath the heart tree where his father had stood, where his father's father had likely stood, where oaths were leaves and wind was witness. Ghost moved like a pale wisp among the roots, and the weirwood's face, carved and ancient, watched with that sorrowful patience peculiar to trees and the dead. There was no priest, and there was no sermon, only the soft rasp of his own breath and the iron smell of sap from the face where tears had once run crimson in stark legends. He had not meant to return. Some men returned to the north as if to a womb, sliding back into old walls and habits as easily as tired men into warm beds. John had come back a stranger. Winterfell belonged to Sansa now, to the scaffolds, to fresh whitewash on charred stones, to banners that were mended and not yet sure if they believed themselves. He had told himself he would only come for a season, to mend that which could be mended, to let the quiet of the snow smooth what the war had flayed raw. But the realm has a way of sending its voices into quiet places. They came with traitors and broken sellswords and with raven gossip that settled like soot. They came with whispers of a sword that was once a kingdom's promise. The letter had arrived bound up in twine and wax, the seal unknown. A stag severed down the middle so that antlers splintered like lightning. Inside had been a scrap of vellum, brittle at the edges, smelling faintly of fish oil and damp cellar. A name was written there, spidery, Melis, and beneath a place, the drowned archive, hard home of books, bravos. Such names had the stink of charlatans. Hard home, more burned myth than surviving truth. But the drowned archive a man could find, or so Davos had said, peering down at the vellum, sucking his broken teeth with that soft, disapproving note of a sailor who hears of a voyage he won't be able to forbid. Bravos, Davos had murmured. If you want ghosts, M-Lord, I can find you a graveyard nearer by. The Titan eats men like us for porridge. Sansa had looked from one to the other, eyes cool and thoughtful, and John had known then that he would go. You could never lie to your sisters. They could see the unchosen paths gathering around you like hounds. She rested her hand on the table map where pins marked the grain stores, where roads had been drawn in newly, where bridges were still imaginary. If you must chase after southern swords, she said, take our ships, not your honor, and take someone who loves you. Arya is no ship, John said, but it was a poor joke, and all of them knew it. Arya would not return for such a chase. Arya belonged to roads and names that changed like clothes. I'll take Davos. When the boat slid between the Titan's legs under a sky of hammered pewter, the oarsman chanting softly, John felt the Bravosi wind find the seams in his cloak and settle there. It smelled of salt, sewage, old iron, and something spiced that reminded him, absurdly, of Winterfell's kitchens on a feast day. The city rose up like a great barnacle with lamps in its shell, and the water hummed with voices, not songs, but the thrifty chant of a counting house. Ghost hated boats, hated cities worse. He had remained in the north, pacing the godswood with the patience of wolves who understand time better than men. The drowned archive lived beneath a tanner's yard in a ward where the alleys were narrow and strung with linen, a place where you kept your hand on your purse and your purse under your shirt. The girl who met them at the door was thin as a pin and dressed as if she had pilfered a dozen wardrobes and stitched the choicest bits together. A curtain tassel for a belt, a lord's sleeve for a kerchief, a fisherman's net for a shawl. She gave a mocking bow that, in another life, would have been a curtsy. "My maitre has been waiting," she said in clear, clipped common that had a water-bright edge. "This way." They went down stairs that were more holes than steps, into air that grew cooler and more crowded with the smell of mildew and lamp oil. The archive was not a place so much as a stubbornness. Paper bled out of shelves in tongues, scrolls slept in jars like pickled snakes. The maitre himself sat upon a stack of ledgers as if upon a throne. He had the look of men who had once been fat and were now unraveling, loose skin like a discarded glove, eyes that were hungry with nothing left to feed on but ideas. "You seek a name," he said, as if continuing a conversation already lost to time. "All men do, kings most of all. They think they seek crowns, but crowns know nothing except what name holds them up. Some names are tired, some are worn out, some have never been tried against the weather. Yours has weight. His gaze slipped down to Jon's hands, to the scars. Winter has sharpened it. Forgive me, Lord Snow. I speak too often and listen too well to words none of you would care about. Let us be crass. You seek Blackfyre. Jon had not spoken the name aloud. He felt it as a pressure against his ribs, like a storm waiting behind hills. I was told you would know where not to look. The maître's smile tilted. That is a better question than where. Blackfyre is a quarrel as much as a sword, and quarrels rarely lie down where you leave them. Once, a bastard king took it from a father to make himself more than a shadow. Then another bastard took it away, and then another did not take it back, and that not taking made a kingdom bleed. The Golden Company had a habit of polishing old stories until they gleamed like new coins. But even Sellswords know a blade is heavy to carry when it demands a realm in its scabbard. They hid it, or lost it, or bartered it for ships, cannons, the names of men. So many versions that truth itself became embarrassed and left the room. And yet, Davos said easily, his sailor's shoulders relaxed, his eyes narrowed in friendly skepticism. You sent to us. Why? Because Winter took a king's sword and broke it, the maître said. And I heard a whisper that Winter wished it back. Not the same sword, not the same king, but the same hunger in the metal. He slid down from his ledger throne with odd grace and shuffled through a collapsed archway. They passed oils and inks and an old knight in rusted mail asleep over a folio, snoring like a kettle. In the back room was something that was not a chest so much as an unmade coffin nailed shut and strung about with charms. Faded olive pits on red strings, crescents of hammered tin, a child's tooth, a shard of sea glass. The maître glanced at Jon's face and gave a tiny shake of his head. If you touch them, you will break them, he said, and unfastened each charm with careful fingers, as if undoing 100 years' worth of knots bound by a dozen frightened hands. Under all that was a long sack of sailcloth. He drew it forward and untied it, pulled back the fabric, and there lay a sword shape made of pieces, broken not by strike but by anger, blackened, pitted, cruelly snapped near the hilt, the fuller warped. Yet the steel drank the lamplight with that same peculiar thirst that was the signature of Valyria. It was not named when it came, the maître said, but it had an aura of a song half remembered. I would not sell it to anyone. Too many men wanted it for the wrong reasons. A woman from Qohor offered 3 ships and a witch to bless my bed. A Lyseni bought me dinner and tried to cut my throat rather than pay. There were whispers this was Blackfyre. There were whispers this was a lie of that same sword, to call out men with too much pride and too little sense. I kept it because it was safer here than where it wished to be. Swords like this call to kings and bastards the same. I did not wish to watch another city burn because a man thought himself strong enough to rename the world. And now you bring it out, Davos said. Because the world has already been renamed twice since I grew my last tooth, the maître said dryly. And because your name will not be made by this thing. It may only be read by it. If you are who I think you are, it will read you. If not, it will sulk in your scabbard like a cat and claw you when you sleep. Take it, Lord Snow. Or walk away. Jon reached. The first thing he felt was cold. Not the agreeable chill of steel, but the winter in a stone room when the fire has died and only your breath knows you are still alive. The second thing he felt was a pull, as if the metal remembered what it was to be whole and knew that something in him might be able to answer that memory. He lifted the sailcloth and the weight was wrong, shifting, treacherous. The blade lay in 3 major fragments with a fistful of black sand that might once have been the space between them. He could not tell if the hilt had been theirs originally or a later deceit. The crossguard was plain, without dragon wings. The pommel was a bare disc. Davos cleared his throat. If it is Blackfyre, he said softly, men fought over this like wolves over a carcass. They still do, the maître said, just more politely. There is only one man in the East who could reforge this, Davos went on. 2, Jon said. If one believes in dragons. Tobo Mott had died rich and unpopular in King's Landing, or so they were told. Qohor still had its secrets, but Qohor demanded a pilgrimage of blood that Jon would not make, not after all that had been bled already. There was another road. It lay through an abandoned hall near the Blackwater where the roof had fallen and the ivy had taken the gate. It lay through a stable rebuilt after another king's fire, where boys mucked and men cursed, and a horseshoer who had once been someone else looked up when Jon's shadow fell across his doorway. Gendry had shoulders that could lift kingdoms and a forge that made them possible. He squinted at the sack when Jon laid it upon the bench, lifted one piece of the sword with calloused fingers, and swore in a blacksmith's language, which is to say he named saints and metals and fires mothers and fathers. "Valyrian," he said at last, the word coming grudgingly. "You want me to weld rain to thunder. If I could do that, I'd buy the Red Keep and sell the stones for bread." "You have done more with less," Davos said, his smile sharp now. "I've seen you hammer a barrel hoop into something a prince could wear and look clever doing it." Gendry's eyes flicked to Jon with the wary affection of men who know each other's scars. "I can't promise you the old sword back," he said. "If this is that sword. Blackfyre, they call it. I can't promise its story won't be cracked and show when it comes out of my fire, but I can promise a sword. It will have to be fed steel that knows the same songs. There's a dull blade in the armory no one touches because it frightens the stable boys. A Dornish lord took it off a corpse at the Trident and brought it home slick with blood like lacquer. He lost his head before he could sell it. I can melt it, and we hunt the rest. Old blades, piecemeal, anything that drank Dragonfire long enough to remember the taste. Even then," he held up the broken shard so that it caught a desert of light. "Even then it will be a new thing wearing an old name." Jon thought of the heart tree's face, of how the tears carved into it did not belong to any man, and yet they cut him. "I don't need the old sword," he said. "I need the realm to believe it remembers something truer than its fears." "Belief is a softer iron," Gendry said. "But I can hammer that too, if you bring me fire." There were no dragons left in King's Landing, not in the way that mattered. Drogon had flown east and vanished into cloud-scattered rumors. Jon had not expected to find him. He had not expected the first breath of the dragon's presence to shudder along his skin like an old fever remembered, or to look up from a desolate ridge beyond Pentos and see a shadow larger than a keep fall across the ground. The beast stooped like a hawk to the lure, and its landing stunned the air. He smelled salt and night, and the sweetish stink of charred Drogon's eyes were the cruel, curious eyes of cats and kings. The dragon lowered his head to sniff Jon's hand, as if the hand were a riddle he had solved once and forgotten. "Girl," came a voice like gravel, and Jon turned to see a woman standing there with a cane and a cloak of rough spun that made her look like any other beggar. Her hair had gone to ash. Her eyes burned red as a banked coal in a wind. He knew her before she smiled. "No, not girl. I was thinking of someone else. Tired habit. You will always be a boy to me, Jon Snow. Boys are for saving. Men are for judging." "Melisandre," he said. The name did not hurt the way it once had. "You're still alive." "Not for long," she said amiably enough. "I have a last warmth to give. I kept it in case. And here is the case." She gestured with her cane at the wrapped bundle slung across his shoulder. "I smelled its thirst half a port away. It wants to be whole. You want to be whole. The dragon wants to remember what it burns for. You think you can wed all three?" Jon said. "I think I can stand in the doorway and let them choose you," she said. "You were always the inconvenient truth the Lord of Light handed me like a puzzle box. I burned too much trying to open you by force. Now I am old enough to know doors with good hinges open best." He did not ask how she had found Drogon, or how Drogon had tolerated her. Some questions you tuck away for a telling that might never be safe. She led him to a natural amphitheater of rock where the wind ran around the circle like a dog. Drogon lay his great head along the rim and watched the little labor with the mild interest of kings who have eaten. Gendry had come because Jon asked, because men like Gendry did not stop working when the work moved across seas, because something in all of them admitted a secret. that to build a thing for which stories have no words is better than sleep. They set the fragments on an anvil that looked like a buried moon. The brazier was a parody of power, a ring of iron, a bed of coal. Melisandre leaned on her cane, breathing thinly. "I am almost done with my last summer," she said, and smiled as if admitting a scandal. "I will put what remains of me into this flame as a hand rests in water. You will be gentle with me when the water is too deep." "Don't," Jon said before he could stop himself. "Don't die for my sword." "I don't die for swords," she said. "I die for endings. This one wants a beginning. We will compromise." She took from her cloak a shard of crystal that flickered weirdly with light that had no source in sun or lamp. She let it rest in her palm. "I have prayed to a god who burns men and a god who sleeps in the water. I have burned children and saved none. I have grown weary of gods. But fire, Jon, fire is honest. Fire eats lies and wants more. If you set your heart in fire, you will know what shape it is when the heat has done with you." "Come." Jon took the tongs. Gendry fed coal. "It won't be enough," he said through his teeth. "Not without." Drogon opened one lid and rolled a dragon eye toward them. And in that lizard gold was something not unlike humor. The dragon rose with the slow confidence of things that have no equal. He unfolded like a storm. When he breathed, the first breath was a sigh, like bellows filling. The second breath was a plume that kicked the air and rocked Jon back on his heels. Heat leapt over him like a dog and tried to lick his face. He felt his eyebrows tightening into crisp, felt his lips crack from within and tasting salt. The glow leapt through the fragments, and the metal sang. Gendry shouted above the roar, and the shout was joy. He struck. Sparks sprang in constellations. The air smelled of iron and fat and something like cinnamon if cinnamon were a memory of screaming. Melisandre stepped forward and set the crystal among the coals. It hissed and shrank with a sound like a woman laughing through clenched teeth. She held out her hands as if warming them, sighed, and let the cane fall. It clattered down the rocks and startled a lizard into the sunlight. Jon watched the edges blur. He watched the seams glow awash with living red. He had seen men die and men be born, and neither had seemed to him so indecently intimate as watching steel relearn its skin. Gendry hammered as if he had been born with a hammer in his fist. The dragon's fire scalded the world into a few simple truths. Can you stand? Can you hold? Can you shape this while it shapes you? Hours became a blister and then a dream, and then there was only a long exhale from Drogon, and the light sank back into whatever place it comes from when it is not needed. Melisandre lay on the stone, smiling at a ceiling without sky. Jon knelt, and for a moment he thought to push breath into her, then stopped. Her eyes were open. They did not see him, but they saw something, and that something soothed her in a way the world never had. He closed them finally with 2 fingers and the old grief rose, but it was a softer thing. He had run out of sharp edges for certain kinds of sorrow. Gendry stood swaying, black with soot from hairline to heel. He lifted the blade with both hands, and for a time Jon could not look at it for what it made the air do. When he could bear it, he saw that it was not black but rather so dark a gray that blackness had to apologize. The ripples along the steel were not waves so much as fingerprints pressing outward. He had seen Longclaw drink light, but this sang it back in a lower register men felt more than heard. The guard had been forged plain, then chased by Gendry's steady knife with a motif of bare branches. The pommel was again a disc, but within the disc Gendry had set a dragon's. I know Gem, just a clever trick with steel and acid. A new thing wearing an old name. What will you call it? Gendry asked, wrung dry. It already has a name, Jon said. He did not take the sword. Not then, not until he had washed Melisandre with his own hands in a stream that chatted like it knew secrets. Not until he and Gendry had raised a cairn of stones that the wind would fret at. Not until Drogon had blown one soft cloud of ash across the cairn, as if anointing it with what dragons have instead of tears. Then Jon took the blade, and it was not heavy and it was not light. It was a simple exactness. His hand knew immediately how high the edge could go before it would sing. and where the spine would be willing to turn aside a blow without sulking. It wanted no blood. It wanted truth. He did not know what that meant. He sheathed it, and the land seemed to approve by going quiet. The first man he showed it to in Westeros tried to kneel. Jon stopped him. "I am not your king. You will be," said Edric Hill, who had once been a squire and had somehow contrived to become an emissary of 3 minor lords and 2 major merchants. "You carry a ghost, lord. It tugs at a man's eyes." He rubbed his own as if he'd been weeping. "They say Blackfyre comes to break kings. They say it comes to make them. They say it comes to bring back lost sons or bury them. I don't know a thing about swords, truth be told. But that is a name even cobblers know. If you walk into a hall with that thing and don't walk out wearing a crown, it will be the hall's fault, not your lack of trying." "I do not want to break the realm," Jon said. "I want to keep it from breaking itself." "Then you'll need a better lie than not wanting a crown," Edric said cheerfully. "But a true sword is a start." The Golden Company broke first, which was a kind of private joke between the realm and its bitterness. They did not break in battle, not at the beginning. They broke by sending a letter sealed in yellow wax and bravery. The letter said, "We will not fight that blade." The men who could read explained it to the others, and the others shrugged and drank and began quietly to make plans to go home. The captains in their tents tore up parchment maps and shouted about contracts, and those shouts were quieter than fear. Then a sellsword in a tavern in Old Town bragged that he had seen Blackfyre. He said it was not what men thought. He said it was a stark sword wearing a dragon's face, a trick blade. He said the man who wore it did not wear a crown. He wore a frown like any other northern lord. He laughed and showed a mouth mostly empty of teeth. He forgot to look over his shoulder as men do when they mock the wrong rumor. The next day, a different rumor grew fat on the old one, that the sellsword had been found with his tongue in his hand. Jon heard it over porridge and wished to spit, because it was the sort of rumor a realm tells itself when it is too afraid to admit it wants the myth to be true. He said nothing. He ate his porridge slowly like a man learning again the business of being alive. Sansa wrote from Winterfell with a hand that was warm and unsentimental. She said, "If you mean to step into the south with that blade, step firmly. If you mean to stay, then stay and let them eat their hearts out. If you mean to use it only as a lever to pry men's promises from their reluctant lips, beware. Levers break, or worse, become the thing men notice instead of the work you are doing. Remember, kings are stories. Some are cautionary, some are lullabies, some are marching songs. Choose the song you can sing every night without hating it." Arya sent no letter. She sent a feather. Jon did not need to ask whose wing had given it up. He wore it tied under his shirt like a charm against bad choices. He walked into his first hall with Blackfyre at his hip in White Harbor. Manderley had waxed thinner since Jon last saw him. Grief takes weight from men with the stinginess of bankers. He rose and the hall rose with him because that is how great houses say hello. He asked to see the blade, and Jon showed it without taking it from the scabbard. The old lord's hand hovered over the leather, and he chuckled, shaking his head. "If I grasp it, I will not give it back," he said. "Not because I need it, but because I am a boy in my marrow. Boys think if they ask nicely for a dangerous toy, the world will relent." "I will make no claim here," Jon said, aware of the way the air seemed to draw itself taut around his words. "I have come to ask for ships." "Ships I have," Manderley said, "though fewer seaworthy ones than songs suggest." "What do you mean to do with them?" "Go south into a country of wounds and see which are curable," Jon said. "There is too much rot under the tapestries. Men smile while their kitchens burn. Someone must open windows. If I carry a sword that bullies men into my way, I will not pretend otherwise. But I will not ask it to murder for me. I will ask it to stop men lying when they look in their mirrors." Manderley stared. Then he laughed until his elbows gave out and he sat, wheezing. "Seven save us," he said when breath returned. "You are your father's son even when you aren't. All right, ships, my captains will groan, but they will obey." A Manderley looks south when the north is quiet. And if the south has no need of us, well, then we summer in Sisterton and eat little fish with too many bones. They sailed with banners that were nothing but canvas, no sigil, no boast. Rumors sailed faster. At White Isle, fisherfolk waved and threw shells and shouted the names of dead kings to see which one would stick. At Gulltown, a gaunt woman threw rotten figs and wept. At Dragonstone, the wind itself seemed to hold its breath, and John felt the old drag of duty wrap around his ribs. He did not set foot on the black steps. He stood in the boat and listened. Dragons are not the only things that can haunt castles. He left a wreath of driftflow, airs at the place where a small stone remembered a queen and rode back without prayer. King's Landing did not look like a place that believed in anything but survival. The city had learned how to keep breathing while it still hurt. Banners hung because they are cheaper than mending souls. A weak king kept a strong hand on his cup, and his council played at chairs while the floor slid under them like a boat's. The first time John walked the street of steel again, boys came running ahead of him, pointing and whistling, the way boys make their own parades. "Northmen!" they cried. "Northmen with a ghost sword." The men in the forges paused to watch him pass, and in their squint he saw respect without love, wariness without hatred. He stopped before the ruin that had been Tobo Mott's, turned cobbles with his boot, and felt the city staring. He drew Blackfyre and laid it on a cracked anvil and did nothing, and it was enough. Looking was the beginning of mending sometimes. Davos had a different hall to visit and a different manner. He collected whispers the way boys collect pretty stones and laid them out on the table every night until patterns appeared. "The Reach is a pile of roses with bees in it," he said, tapping. "The bees are angry. The Stormlands keep trying to remember what to be. The Riverlands have decided grief is a crop and they will harvest it properly if it kills them. Dorne is laughing at all of us." He grinned. "They've earned the laugh. Will any of them march?" John asked. "Will any of them sit? I do not need all of them. I need the right few. Better a few oars that pull together than 100 that splash," Davos said. "But you still need a drum to beat time on." Blackfyre was the drum. He let it be seen. He let it be whispered about more than shown. He took it to lords who had no love for him and who had less for broken promises. He placed it on their tables like salt. He did not boast. He spoke plainly of taxes forgiven and oaths required and grain from the north moving south like blood. He spoke of watchers on roads rather than swords on walls. He spoke of men with knives under their pillows being coaxed back into kitchens. When he had to, he spoke of the sword and watched men straighten, instinctive, as if the spine itself wished to stand straighter in its presence. A lord from the Crownlands with a face like curdled milk sneered that he would not be ruled by a bastard with a counterfeit toy. John said very quietly that the toy had been reforged with the help of a dragon. The lord sneered again and made some poor joke about Mummer's dragons, at which point Blackfyre sang. It left its scabbard and kissed the lord's goblet, and the goblet fell in two neat halves, and wine and silence spilled across the carpet with the same red. The lord's eyes were very large. John sheathed the sword. The lord's son, behind him, began to laugh, high and thin, and could not stop. John gathered the halves of the goblet and set them together. "You were mistaken," he said to the father. "It is not a toy." He wrote to Sansa to tell her he had been mannerly, and Sansa wrote back to tell him that mannerliness is not always the point. Rule what you can. Protect what you must. She sent him a small packet filled with a powder that made old wounds itch and close, and on days when his back ached and his mind was full of winter, he would open the packet and let the smell of the north sting him into better temper. The first banner to bend was not one he had expected. Lady Eleonora of the Hayfields, whose lands were unimportant enough to be constantly fought over by men with more important banners, sent to John for wheat. He sent her grain at cost and asked for nothing but that she tell him which road her wagons had taken, and if the men at the crossroads took 2 coins instead of 1. She sent back a ledger better kept than half the kingdoms. When men came to take her fields, her farmers stood with scythes and politely informed the men they could leave or they could lie down and be hay. They left, Eleonora sent John 1 silver coin. On one side a plow was stamped, on the other a sword in a sheath. That coin began to appear in other purses and on other tables. John never ordered it to be minted. He did not need to. Enemies emerged. They always do when men begin to arrange themselves with purpose. A river lord named Harwin Pike, by a joke of birth and a quirk of marriage, declared that no man without a king's blood would be allowed to order him where to send his boats. John did not argue blood. He sent a letter with a map of bridges repaired and exacted tolls and the names of men whose families would starve if grain did not arrive on time. Harwin sent back the map with a note describing where he had wiped his ass. He set fire to his own storehouses to deny John a story of mercy there. John went to him with only Davos and Gendry and a dozen Northmen who looked like they were made of doors. Harwin had 30 men. He wanted to fight at dawn. John asked if he could fight at noon instead after they had both eaten breakfast and had a shit in peace. Harwin laughed and agreed and was dead by noon. John stood over the body and told the others to take off their banners and form a line. He had Blackfyre out, not to kill, but to point to the road east. He told them they could go home with their horses if they left their armor. He told them if they wished to join him, they could join a caravan and carry sacks for pay. He told them if any of them burned a barn again, he would hang them and not apologize. They looked not at his face but at his sword, and John realized then that the blade had begun to speak for him even when he did not draw it. That frightened him. He tightened his hand. He made himself say the thankless things, the boring things, the things that kings who liked glory forgot to say. There will be rationing this winter in the east. There will be repairs that take 2 seasons in the west. There will be fewer so. NGS for a time and more books of numbers. The crown, such as it was, finally sent for him in a huff. The boy on the throne wanted to see the bastard with the impolite steel. The hand, a careful man with the eyes of a mouse who has lived this long by noticing cats, wanted to see if John could be bought. The Queen Regent wanted to see if he could be seduced. None of them wanted to see a mirror, but that is what he was. He walked into the Red Keep as if it were an inn, the kind with bad wine and good bread. He made bows where one did that sort of thing, and he did not when men confused bowing with worship. The boy asked to see the sword. John said no. The boy laughed because boys do, but something in him understood boundaries and was grateful. The hand asked what John wanted. John said, grain moved without theft, justice to be predictable, taxes to be boring, roads to be safe, debt to be counted honestly, and time to do those things in before anyone asked for pageantry. The regent smiled and asked for the real answer. John answered the same way and watched her start to get angry so that she would not have to get afraid. Do you mean to claim the realm? The hand asked finally, the mouse in him sneaking out to the edge of the cupboard. You would have support. Enough, perhaps, to be a nuisance. More, perhaps, to be a transformation. You brought a myth into the city, Lord Snow. The city likes myths. They taste better than porridge. I mean to claim my work, John said. If the realm wants to call that rule, I won't argue the word on bad days. I will only argue the numbers. Numbers are not romantic, the regent said with disdain. They are fair, John said, if you put them in the open where everyone can argue them. Fairness is more romantic than men admit. He left the Red Keep without kneeling, and the king waved like a child who has seen a dog do a trick that made him feel kinder for a moment. On the steps of Baylor's September, a woman selling flowers dared ask to see the sword. John drew an inch. She did not scream. She nodded, as if to a lover who had kept his word, and went back to calling out lilies, fresh lilies, lovers' lilies. He bought one and tucked it behind his ear and did not care when Davos snorted. It did not happen all at once. Nothing good ever does. The bees settled in the reach a little. Dorn sent him a letter with a pressed orange blossom and 3 lines of poetry that could be read 3 ways. He chose the reading that made the future more possible. The Riverlands grudgingly agreed to stop drowning in their own tears and plant. The Stormlands sent rough men with rougher hands who learned quickly that a schedule is not a chain but a blessing. The Crownlands continued to be a sulk, but a useful one. Sulking is a kind of attention. There were conspiracies, as there always are when a myth enters a room and eats a few lies. A hedge priest declared Blackfyre a demon blade that would drink the blood of firstborns on the new moon. When it drank no blood that night except John's by accident as he cut bread, the priest became a poet instead and began composing ballads about honesty. A woman in green lace claimed the sword made men sterile and offered a charm against it at a fair price. When a boy she had charmed got a girl with child, she fled to a ship and sailed for the Basilisk Isles, where her skills would have a more honest market. An exiled lord from the Stepstones sent an assassin with a needle thin as spite. The assassin found John unguarded in an inn, sat down across from him, and quietly asked if the blade would mind very much being given back to the east. John told him no. The assassin cried a little, not because he was sentimental, but because he had lived for so long on hard bread that tears seemed a new taste, and then he went away to find a different fate. Gendry returned to his forge. Davos returned to his maps. John returned to the road again and again until the road began to feel like a house he could live in, and the hearth was any table where men argued about grain without drawing knives. On a morning like any other, under a sky the color of linen just brought in from the line, the realm claimed him. It did not do it with trumpets or a riot. It did it with a cue. He stood in a field outside Tumbleton where refugees had become villagers by refusing to move again, and he had a ledger open, and he had a stick in his mouth to stop himself from swearing when the sums failed to sum. A boy stepped out of the line with a crown. It had been made of willow switches and the silver band from a keg and 4 coins stamped with plows. He offered it to John with the earnestness children give to mistakes they think are clever. John looked at the thing. He had been offered gold by men who would use the metal to pull him. The willow had no pull at all. He set the crown on the boy's head and said, "There, now you are king of your morning. Go tell the baker he is to feed your army at a fair price." The laugh went through the line and came back sweeter. The boy ran, crown wobbling. Then Lady Eleonora walked out of the line with a second crown. Hers was iron. It had the simple self-respect of an honest tool. She held it and did not offer it. She simply held it while the line watched. Then she spoke in a voice that had been trained by the field and by making men in better boots behave. "We are foolish if we wait for a hall to tell us what we already know," she said. "We will have a king. We will have one who refuses to be a king except at the places where it counts. We will have a king who will not ask us to sing for him, but will sing with us if he thinks it will sew up a torn day. We have a sword that is less dangerous than the man who carries it. We will have Jon Snow." She looked at him, daring him to lie to her. "We will have him." He thought of Sansa's letter. He thought of Arya's feather. He thought of the heart tree and of Longclaw and of a frozen boy half dead on a table who had been and tricked into living again by a red woman. He thought of a dragon who had given them breath enough to bend metal. He thought of men who wanted him for his myth and not for his patience. He thought of numbers. He thought of fairness. He thought of refusal as a kind of vanity. And he thought of the blade at his side, a new thing wearing an old name. He knelt. The crowd gasped because kings do not kneel, but men do. He bowed his head. "If I wear it," he said, and the words seemed to come from the ground, "I wear it for the realm and not for my pride. If I fail, I will take it off." Eleonora set the iron on his hair. He felt it as a coolness that did not deny the sun. He rose, and there was no trumpet, and there was no prayer, but there was the sound of men adjusting their grips on shovels and the rustle of grain sacks being lifted. Someone shouted, "Hail!" and no one took up the cry because they were too busy. It was perfect. Blackfyre rode his hip not like a menace but like an oath. When lords asked to see it, he showed them. When fools asked it to judge in their favor, he let them hear the silence that meant no. When the crown in King's Landing finally wobbled and fell, he did not go to pick it up. He walked to the counting house and made the clerks write the numbers on doors where anyone could read them. He sent letters with maps to men who had forgotten how roads work. He sent Davos with coin and patience to the docks. He sent Gendry with steel and patience to the forges. He went to the September and to the mother houses and to the little shrines built to gods that had no names but were good at listening to women in trouble. He went to small councils he did not convene, and when they argued he smiled and did not enjoy it, and when they agreed he allowed himself a bite of bread with honey. He slept on a pallet in inns when he could and in tents when he had to, and sometimes, when the day had been kind, in clean sheets that smelled of lavender and good laundry. The last man who thought to test Blackfyre did so not on a field but in a corridor. He was young and silly and brave in the way of lords who have been told they are gods by their mothers. He reached for the hilt on John's hip with a laugh. He did not get the chance to laugh again. John's hand had moved before his thinking did, not to cut but to bind. He trapped the boy's wrist and squeezed until the boy's knees informed him he was mortal. "Ask," John said, the words soft and unembarrassed. "You may look, you may even touch, but you will not take." The boy nodded, eyes bright with a new lesson. John released him and drew the sword and laid it across his palm so the boy could see his own face in it. The boy did and saw himself and did not flinch. John took this as a good omen and had no reason to regret it later. Winter will come again. There are things no king or sword can defy. When it did, and the first hard frost wrote its white lines across the barley, John walked the fields with farmers and let them tell him what they already knew. When a butcher's guildmaster tried to squeeze coin from men with no coin, John sat with him and showed him his ledger until the man's anger grew bored and wandered off. When a ship from Bravos arrived with a boy carrying a tattered cloak in grief where armor should go, John took him to the godswood and let him sit until the tree's silence stole the sharp edges of his mourning, and then gave him a job sweeping steps. In time, songs came. They always do when men tire of arguing about numbers and long for a plot they can remember. Some were stupid, some were sweet, some had him married to a dozen queens, some had him a monk beneath his own throne. He ignored them as a man ignores flies. On an evening in White Harbor, under lamps that made the water look like lacquered wood, he heard a new one sung by a girl whose voice had the clean line of early winter. It told of a bastard who brought an old sword back from fire and asked it to be accountable. It told of a realm that remembered how to be hungry for fairness and not only for war. It told of a king who kept taking his crown off in his head in order to sleep. He smiled and sent for more wine and for bread, and then sent half the bread back because he remembered another table with no bread on it at all. Years later, when the iron had polished itself against his brow until it no longer felt like an interruption, a delegation from Qohor came with their own myths wrapped in their own velvet. They wanted to see the blade. The oldest of them wept when she did, and held out her hands and asked in a tongue John barely knew if she could touch it with the tips of her fingers. He told her yes, and she touched it as if it were a warm loaf and not a weapon, and she smiled in the way men and women smile when something they feared turns out to have teeth that bite only what they are told. "It is not the old one," she said in broken common, pleased. "It is better. It remembers its promise and not only its pride." John thought that might be the only epitaph he ever needed, if kings are allowed epitaphs. Not the old one, better. He slept that night without dreams, with the window open, and listened to the city breathe like a tired animal finally given good hay. One autumn, a letter came from the north with 2 leaves pressed inside, one red, one brown. Sansa wrote only 3 lines. They were the lines he had built his rule atop without needing to read them to know them. The first was, "We are still mending." The second was, "It is slower than songs but truer than winter." The third was, "Come home for a month if you can." He went. He hung the iron crown on a peg above a door in a room without guards and told no one where he had put it. He took Blackfyre with him because you do not abandon promises at pegs. In the godswood, the heart tree's face looked the same, as trees do when men believe they have changed. Ghost came out from between the roots with a soft woof, and John knelt into the thick white coat and let the dog smell his hair and his hands and his new lines. He drew the sword and held it up to the bleeding leaves. In the steel the leaves seemed to be fire and blood both, and then they were only leaves. "You did not break the world," he told the blade under his breath, like a confession or a prayer. "You did not fix it either. We'll have to go on doing both." forever. Blackfyre did not answer. It did not need to. It had been melted and made and used to cut bread and threats and time. It was a new thing wearing an old name. He would be, too, as long as he could manage it. He stayed the month and a week besides, which is the sort of theft kings are allowed if they return what they have stolen with interest. When he left, the north did not seem farther from the south so much as the other side of a coin that would keep buying what men needed if they were careful with it. On the shivering sea, the wind lifted like a woman's skirt and tried to make trouble. But the captain knew his business, and so did the oars. Davos waited in White Harbor with charts and an expression that said a new kind of mischief had been found. Papers to sign, disputes about river water rights that would require a day or two of stubbornness and a late supper. Jon took the papers and asked the questions and listened to the answers and very rarely drew the sword. In the end, he claimed the realm not because he wore a crown or because he carried a fabled blade, but because 1,000 small acts lined up behind him and decided he was their spine. Blackfyre never became a tyrant. It hung on the wall in his working room more days than it rode at his hip, a reminder that steel could be an argument instead of a scream. Sometimes he would take it down and oil it, and the scent would open a door in his head that led to a dragon's breath and a woman's last warmth and a smith's laughter. He would think of the Maître in the drowned archive and his sly smile and wonder if the man still sat on ledgers, watching for another name heavy enough to deserve the trouble of reforging. He supposed there would be others. The realm is a stubborn wheel. It wants turnings. At the very last bend of an ordinary year, when the frost made patterns on windows like writing from a god who bargained in beauty instead of blood, a girl came to him in a brown cloak too big for her and asked if he would show her the sword. He did. She looked at it and then at him. "It doesn't look like it wants to bite," she said, disappointed. "It doesn't," Jon said. "That's why I carry it." She nodded solemnly, accepted this as the kind of odd thing adults say that might be true, and ran off to see if the baker had any honey left. Jon watched her go. He looked down at the blade. It looked back as much as steel looks, that sober, faithful way that unmagical things have when men have put magic on them by believing. He put it away, laid his crown beside it, and turned back to the ledger. Somewhere in the city, a song began. It was the one about fairness. He smiled, poised his pen, and went on with the work. Snow came late that year, which would have pleased farmers if not for the east wind that slept in the hedgerows and woke suddenly to bruise their cheeks. Jon stood with his cloak thrown back at the hip where Blackfyre hung unglamorous and clean, and watched men build a bridge with the same solemnity they would bring to a burial. The river had taken the last one in an early spring flood years ago, and the road had found ways around as roads do, but those ways had made wolves fat and thieves lazy. He preferred the bridge. The timbers dragged by oxen smelled of pine and bruised sap. Gendry shouted from the scaffold about pins and wedges, his voice carrying like a bell. Davos sat on a barrel and read a list down to a boy who held a board steady with all his thin strength. No songs, no banners. Only would learning to trust would again. A rider came fast up the new embankment, stirrups chattering, cloak flared to show no colors, which was a color in itself. Jon watched the horse's hocks fold as it came to a quick standstill in the muck. The rider pulled off his hood. His beard had more white in it than Jon recalled, and his smile had less, but the eyes were the same, skeptical as a river that has carried too many bodies. Jon Royce swung down, favored his knee, and bowed just enough to keep old habit from stiffening into pride. "Your Grace," he said. Jon disliked the way the title made the air hitch. He nodded toward the timbers. "You came to test whether I truly build bridges instead of burning them?" "I came because my ravens keep bringing me numbers instead of commandments," Royce said, amused. "And because every boy in Runestone hums a work song with your name hidden somewhere in the chorus. I thought I'd hear the tune at the source." His gaze slid to the sword hilt. The bronze of his armring took the gray daylight and warmed it. "And to see the thing men argue about in rooms that have not seen a broom in years. Steel's the least interesting part of all this," Jon said, "though it does shorten certain conversations." Royce's laughter was honest and brief. "It always did. I have news that runs ahead of me like a bad dog." A sell-sail admiral with more bravado than seamanship limped into a Gulltown tavern and shouted that he'd been paid in violet coin to ferry a company of golden men to a barren rock where their captains held a council under stormlight. The admiral's ship sank that night, which we may assume was coincidental if we like. Then 3 ravens came from 3 harbors. Hard lessons are being unlearned in the stepstones. Someone is banging old drums. Davos lifted his head without lifting his list. "How many ships made for Black Crown?" "Enough," Royce said simply. The wind nudged at Jon's neck, finding the spot that still ached when snow was near. If there's a meeting of swords in the stepstones, it's not for poetry. Tracks are being rewritten, or ancestors are, which is the same thing to certain men, Davos said dryly, rolling the parchment and tying it off with a bit of twine. Golden Company captains do not cross the strait to talk about spice prices. They cross to decide whether to fasten their fortunes to a name. If that name is your sword, they will sell sermons about faithfulness and then go where the coin is fattest. If it's another, it will be another, Royce said. My ears aren't as ornamental as my forebears, and I have heard whispers about a boy whose bloodline is a braid of dead flowers. Claims can be grown like cabbages if you use the right muck. Someone means to plant one on our shore and see if it takes. He watched Jon without moving. I remember men who took oaths until their tongues were sore. Oaths are brittle. Mud holds. Then we'll give the realm better mud, Jon said. And make sure the cabbages feed the kitchens, not the banners. He rode with Royce toward the coast, not to the capital where courtiers made their own weather, but to a low town whose only boast was a lighthouse whose lamp was a stubbornness more than a light. The harbor slapped at stone. Nets hung like tired old men along the quay. A Bravosi cog leaned against the wind on its lines and complained in 3 languages. The harbor master had a beard he stroked as if combing a thought. He led them into a room that smelled of mold and dried fish and kept his cap in his hands. They took no brandy, these men, he said as if the choice were a sin. Paid full. Left by night tide. The captain was from Mir, I think. The men who paid him wore smiles that weren't smiles. Swords on their hips, not peace-bundled. Their banner rolled neat but not well-loved. Did they ask for news of a blade? Davos asked, eyes slitted. The harbor master shook his head. They asked about wheat. About whether the new road has shaved an hour off the south run. About tolls and if the men at the bridge are strict. Men with hard work in front of them ask such things. And men with a pageant ask after trumpets, Davos said. So, not a pageant, a march. Royce had the grace to avoid staring at Blackfyre, though the sword drew glances the way a hearth draws cold hands. Jon kept his palm near the hilt without touching it, a habit that had grown into him the way a scar grows under skin. The lighthouse keeper's daughter shyly set out bowls of stew, crusts of bread, and a little wedge of an old cheese that had survived more winters than any of them could count. Jon ate with the slow, polite hunger of a guest in a house that cannot spare seconds. They asked more questions. The answers were the gentle, homely kind that were easy to ignore and dangerous to forget. A barrel of pitch delivered 2 days early. A blacksmith's apprentice gone suddenly to sea. A singer who had been hired to learn a certain old marching song and then not paid. By moonrise, the shore wind had teeth. Jon stood on the quay and let the spray salt his mouth, and thought of a council held under stormlight on a barren rock where men with contracts spoke about destinies as if they were barrels safely shipped. He had followed shadows before. They led you to holes you could fall into gladly if your pride had exhausted you. He did not want a hole. He wanted a ledger, a list, a plan with rails. He wrote 3 letters and sealed them with plain wax. The first went to Lady Eleonora with a request as curt as it was trusting. Gather the haywains and the cartmen and fix their route schedules tight as harp strings. If they squeal, soothe them with fair rates and songs. The second went to Old Town. He did not love or trust its books, but he trusted certain men who read them. He asked for eyes along the Mander and a little boredom in its toll keepers so that any excitement would stink and be noticed. The third went to Sunspear with a private thanks for the orange blossom and a more private request. If a certain foreign company bought water rights under false names at wells near Planky Town, a mistake in the registry might be in fashion. He sent Davos to the capital because Davos could slip through rooms the way a clever fish moves in a river full of hooks. And he sent Gendry inland with 40 carts and a master list to distribute steel, because steel given honestly at the right moment can be louder than any promise. He went himself to the stepstones. No banners, a hired cog, a dozen quiet Northmen who had learned to take a warm loaf with gratitude and a cold blade with less talk. Royce came because he wanted to see if the world would misbehave itself into sense. The sea greeted them like a stubborn ant and slapped their faces when they leaned over the rail. The Titan was a memory dull as iron. Blackcrown rose out of fog like bad news. They came ashore where rocks grabbed at boots and the only color was the insult of lichen. Men had bled here so long that even gulls were wary. A cave received them with the sullen welcome of places that had learned men's breath by the stink of lies. Lanterns burned. Shadows made themselves important by dragging across the stone too slowly. Jon stood in the mouth of the cavern until he could see the men before they saw him. Contract captains wore their blades like disobedient children. The coin smell was real oil, sweat, the sugar breath of wine. A map sprawled across a crate. A boy held a tally board. The man who was speaking when Jon arrived had a voice like creaking leather, and his hair had been trained to imitate youth and failed. Even when the realm believes in its myths, he was telling the room, grain does not march to the interior without men whose hands close on spears. This is to our advantage. The rivers are guarded by clerks, the roads by peasants with scythes, the watchtowers who are loyal to our cause. He paused, and men who wished to be thought farsighted nodded. We'll light their beacons, and a show of banners will do what takes. A king 3 winters. Jon stepped into the lantern light as simply as a man enters a kitchen. He saw the surprise ripple around like ducks lifting off a pond. He did not walk to the map. He walked to the tally board and, with a courtesy that cut more surely than contempt, took the charcoal from the boy's fingers, wrote a column of numbers neatly, and handed it back. Your sums are wrong, he said, calm, not triumphant. You account for haste and you account for fear, but not for whether mud, mules, small selfishnesses that go by the name of common sense, or for the fact that men who have eaten will fight worse for a week afterward. You have forgotten that bridges stand in their own time and that a cart's axle never cares what banner flaps above it. He looked at the captains and saw greed argue with irritation in their eyes. You have forgotten that men do not move because you like your flags. A sword hissed halfway free. He ignored it. The man with the creaking leather voice recovered first, because men used to telling others what to do are good at pretending interruptions were part of the plan. And who are you, sir, to lecture contracts about carts? Jon placed his palm on Blackfyre's hilt and did not draw. He let the lanterns ride the wavering oil on the blade's mouth just enough that men who had never seen it understood the story without needing it sung. I am the man who mends the axles, he said, and the man who has been known to listen to clerks until they forget to be afraid. Royce's bronze eyes glinted. He is also the king you'll swear you never came to depose when this meeting is over and you are back in your snug chairs, counting the coin you did not earn. The laughter was not kind. Men laugh at truth to see if it will be insulted enough to leave. Jon waited out the sound. In that patience, the room learned the shape of its cowardices. The boy with the tally board looked at the numbers Jon had written and, by slow inches, nodded. A captain with an ermine clasp tugged his mustache. You come alone, your majesty, brave, or foolish, or both. I came to ask you to take your old quarrel and bury it properly, Jon said. You carry a ghost in your purse and you let it do your talking. The realm will not be bought and sold by that voice again. If you believe in your contracts, honor them where they were signed. In kitchens where bread was promised, on docks where cargo was counted, in fields where repairs were to be made. If your contract says you must kill a baker's son to satisfy a lord who will never pay you his second coin, then your contract is a liar and the world will forgive you for breaking it. You speak like a man who thinks justice is a seamstress, the creaking voice sneered. You speak like a Stark who has discovered the South prefers warm beds to cold truths. I speak like a man who has counted sacks, John said, who has buried men, and who has learned that a myth in the mouth of a starving widow is a curse but a loaf is a blessing. He drew the sword a hand's breadth. The metal did not sing like it did for songs. It breathed. Lantern light puddled in its ripples. There will be no Blackfyre king raised by your coin. There will be no pageant in a harbor. There will be no invasion that calls itself homecoming, and there will be no homecoming that calls itself invasion. Go home. Take work. Leave this name to rest. Men are not persuaded by sermons alone. They are persuaded by the shape of failure and by the promise of survival. Behind John's words, there was the quiet math of ships embargoed at 3 small ports because 3 unnoticed clerks had been moved yesterday without fanfare. There was the rumor a Sparmiri wine cellar would whisper tomorrow about tariffs forgiven if certain captains left certain waters. There was the fact that 2 companies' quartermasters were wives of grain factors who had begun to enjoy sleeping without knives beneath their pillows. None of those things are noble. All of them bend history more than trumpets do. It did not end with cheers. It ended with irritation and a slow uncurling from bravado. One man slammed his cup down because cups are easier to abuse than fates. Another tried a poor joke and got the wrong laugh for his trouble. A third demanded to see the blade, so John showed him, let him see his face in it, and asked what he saw there. My father's disappointment, the man said hoarsely and put his hand down. Good, John said. Go disappoint him kindly by living. By the time their ship pulled away from the rocks, the sea had tugged at the light until it tore. Royce leaned on the rail and watched Blackcrown shrink into a dark thought. They'll mutter, he said, and half will try again with new names on old masks. Half is better than all, John said. The wind had finally found its courage and pushed at his ears. I don't need them to love me. I need them to remember that my math holds. Royce snorted. The last king of worth to my house was one who made good roads and kept good ledgers. The songs forgot him. The clans didn't. He clapped John's shoulder. You make the wrong enemies and the right friends. Winter teased and withdrew, sent scouts of frost to map shutters and gutters, and then retreated to sharpen knives. John spent it moving inside the realm the way a physician moves inside a house that keeps warm by habit. Small repairs, long evenings, stubborn mornings. He found a weaver in the Crownlands who had been reduced to spinning lies and brought her a contract for cloth to the mother houses. He found a boatwright whose daughter wanted to mend hulls instead of bake and sent her to Gendry, who had no time for the modesties of fools. He found a bookkeeper in Old Town who had been passed over for a glossier cousin and set her to rewrite the crown's debt with the honesty of arithmetic. He found, too, the Rot, a magistrate whose love of seals exceeded his love of truth, a knight who had grown used to the way. A raised eyebrow opened doors, a baker whose loaves had begun to shrink as his purse grew. He did not cut their heads off. He cut their habits. Took longer. It made better scars. The faith resisted in the way old men resist new boots. The High Septon had a voice made for funerals and the kind of smile that wanted to mean comfort and kept meaning condescension. He asked deferentially for a viewing of the sword. John brought it into the September and laid it openly at the base of the mother's altar. The faithful came and looked with the quiet curiosity of folk who expected either thunder or a trick and found instead good metal. An acolyte reached and then stopped, ashamed of her want. John took her hand and set it on the hilt gently. Her face crumpled with relief at being allowed to want without being punished for it. The High Septon watched and learned nothing. That was all right. Others learned. Sunspear sent not a letter but a woman who arrived with sand in her hem and a smile that had not been on any of John's maps. She introduced herself as Nymeria Santigar and drank the red wine like water without needing it. You ask for registry errors, she said in a courtyard with lemon trees, which is either very clever or very stupid. We prefer cleverness that looks stupid to our enemies, but in this case I think you are only what you say you are. A man who wants caravans to run on time and is willing to let petty swindlers call their cowardice policy, so long as no one starves. I want fewer funerals, John said. She looked him over with the unsentimental curiosity of one who has learned beauty's coinage and finds it overvalued. And what of marriages? Will you make one, your grace, to keep bees where they belong? Dorn does not make a habit of wedding itself to the songs of other men, but it does enjoy a dance. If your numbers are as pretty as your promises, an alliance by my cousin's cousin might be a good joke that ends in a fine harvest. I'll marry where my work tells me to, John said. If it tells me to at all. He thought of crowns and pegs and the way a tent feels steadier when someone sleeps under it who is not oneself. He was not averse to company. He was wary of theater. Nymeria's smile was a blade laid on velvet. Good answer. If you wish for introductions that come with oranges and sarcasm, I can oblige. She grew grave. A word of sand, your grace. The men who just promised not to raise a counterfeit king will cut a new banner tomorrow and name it trade. Be ready for them to set up in the one place you do not yet own. A story you haven't told. He took that warning and treated it like winter. He went to the places in himself where he had assumed a clear field and planted fences. When a pamphlet began to circulate in the Stormlands declaring him a carrot king, orange crown, roots in northern dirt, edible if boiled long enough, he bought a bundle and sent them north with a note to Sansa. She wrote back, "That's rather good. I shall plant them in the glass gardens." He laughed and ate stew and let the insult compost into humor. It was not all slow churn and steady weather. One evening on the Rosby Road, a group of veterans who had lost everything but anger decided to rob the wrong wagon. They harried it expertly and found it full of blankets and bandages and two sisters with the stubbornness of water mills. John arrived with a handful of riders and did not draw Blackfyre. He dismounted into their circle and named their villages without being asked, because he had read the muster rolls himself and remembered everything that stuck where sorrow had stuck it. "You fought at the Blackwater," he said to a man whose shoulders had learned to duck at loud voices. "You were brave. You lost a brother to the fever that came after." He had a laugh like a torn sail. The man began to weep. Another lifted a knife and dropped it because his hand had finally heard what his heart knew. This was the wrong fight. John put the knife back in its sheath himself and told the men where the blankets were going and why. He told them he would find them work. He told them they had already done enough killing and to stop hiding their fear behind someone else's bread. It was ugly and hard and honest. When a boy in the group spat near his boot, John felt the old ice rise and let it. "If you wish to try to kill me," he said, "do, but I promise you a miserable death with no song. If you wish to help, pick up a bale and walk." They walked. In the dark afterward, under a hedge that had more holes than leaves, Davos lit his pipe and said, "You hold a sword that kings bled for, and you use it to cut bread and threads. It's an odd sort of tale we're in." John leaned back on his elbows and watched the smoke lift. "I have no taste left for tales where the hero gets what he wants because the song needs to end," he said. "I prefer the ones where the shepherds live to see the next shearing." "Those are dull tales," Davos said. "They are the ones men need when winter sits outside the door and gnaws," John said. "The bards can invent the rest." Spring came disguised as mud, the way it always does. The Reach, grudging and proud, sent up envoys who wore green the way money wears a purse. They complained about tariffs and smiled about trade and said, "Your Grace," as if the title tasted of nettles. John did not charm them. He did not try. He put numbers in their hands and schedules. He showed them where pots could be mended and where markets could be moved a day later to avoid a waste of eggs. He asked for a pledge that their grain would not be used as a cudgel. They asked for protections that farmers could understand. He gave them. They signed. They left with the relief of men who had expected to be asked for their pride and had been asked instead for their competence. On a fat cloud day, a raven came with a scrap from the wall. Men there had learned to write in a careful hand that made even bad news seem as if it had manners. The Editor said simply, "The snows have opened the old pass by the stone door. There are tracks where tracks should not be. We do not know if they are men or something that has forgotten how. Send us thread and needle and salt." John stared at the words until the script blurred and turned to the boy smudges of his own old reading. He sent thread and needles and salt, twice what was asked, and straps and lamp oil and new boots. He wrote back, "Try not to be heroes," and signed it with no title. Arya came like weather. Suddenly, from a direction that had been quiet for too long, changing the taste of the air. She slid out of shadow near a door in a place she should not have known and grinned like a girl who had stolen back a childhood. "You look the same," she said. "You don't?" he said, joy punching him in the ribs where grief had learned to sit. He took her hands, turned them over to look at the new scars like lines on a map, and then did the only safe thing with happiness. He put it to work. "Stay a while," he said. "Tell me what the men across the sea are whispering to one another. Tell me whether the knives outnumber the cups. Tell me if the boy with the braid of dead flowers is still being watered." "He is," she said, slipping onto a windowsill as if windows were made for perches. "But the gardeners are getting bored. Their fingers itch for other soil. They may try to plant him in your yard when you're looking the other way." "I have neighbors who notice odd men with shovels," Jon said. "And I have a wolf who dislikes intrusion." "Good," she said, satisfaction lazy in her voice. "Also, the Titan sneezed at a ship flying no colors yesterday. People cheered. I haven't worked out why, but I think it matters." "It will matter to someone in 3 weeks," Davos said, scribbling a note to himself. "We'll act like we meant it to." They ate together like children who had learned not to choke. Arya spoke of inns where the bread was better than the ale, and of a woman who claimed to have been married to a sellsword for 3 months by a parson who had since died. Of a little god men in Norvos had begun to praise who wore a crown of twigs and counted fairly. Of a knife maker in Tyrosh whose idea of a compliment was to charge you more. She would not say where she had slept or how often she had forgotten her own name, and he did not ask. She slept 3 nights in a row under the same roof and then was gone, leaving a single coin of Eleonora's make on the table. He took that as a benediction. When trouble finally put on a crown and marched toward him, it did so in a fashionable cloak, with the good manners of a man who expects doors to open because his tailor is honest. The pretender called himself Eamon, or allowed others to call him that, which is a distinction that often smells nice and rots the same. He had the right bones in his face to be a story if men wanted him badly enough. He had blue eyes and a smile that looked like it had been pressed with a seal. The Golden Company, having decided the contract was more amusing this time, offered him escort without the burden of sincerity. 3 lords who had been insulted by arithmetic affixed their names as regents to his proclamation. He landed in a neat harbor with drums that kept provisional time. He announced an amnesty in excellent prose that had been written by a man who had never been hungry. He asked for an audience courteously with the Carrot King. Jon granted it. He built a table in a barn on purpose so that no one would mistake where the meat came from. He wore no crown. He set Blackfyre on 2 trestles where everyone could see it was not going to move unless someone did something unwise. Eamon entered as a man enters a garden and smelled a rose to prove he understood subtleties. He looked at the sword and, to his credit, did not pretend not to be moved. He looked at Jon and smiled the exact smile he had been taught to offer kings and bastards both. "You hold my grandfather's blade," he said gently, as if it were a pity but also very possibly a joke they could laugh about later. "I hold a promise I reforged with my own hands and help," Jon said. "If it ever belonged to a man who wished the realm ill, I have burned that wish out of it." Eamon's lashes flickered. "You speak like a steward, not a sovereign." "I speak like a man who has learned the difference between feasts and winters," Jon said. "What do you want, Eamon?" "To be what I am," the young man said, and there was real hunger there, for a mercy of truth if nothing else. "To bear what I can bear, to raise what is fallen. To spare men the yoke of numbers when they can be led by honor." "Led where?" Jon asked. "Honor is a word with many maps folded into it. Which one do you use when the bridge is out and the cow has died and the tanner's boy is sick?" Eamon's gaze slid. He had learned answers to harder questions but not to homely ones. "We will restore," he said smoothly. "We will mend. You will replace," Jon said softly. "You will set your story on top of men like a clean cloth and pretend the stains have gone. You will call it mercy when you mean forgetfulness." You will call it duty when you mean vanity. I have no quarrel with your blood. I have a quarrel with your timing. There is work. If you want a crown, build 3 roads and bring mothers fewer funerals than your friends think romantic. Then we can talk. The young man's hand had drifted toward his sword, not to draw it, but to remind himself that he could. He retrieved it, color steady. You think you are fairness? He said, the softness gone now, replaced by something truer and uglier. Insulted certainty. You are a winter that will never end. Men do not thrive under tally marks. They thrive under names they can be proud to say. Then say your name, John said, to the miller whose water rights your captains bought and sold in secret. To the widows whose sons your pamphlets promised glory to the girl who carries ledger slates dawn to dusk so that the grain arrives on market day. Say your name to them and see if they wish to be led by it, or if they'd prefer to keep their schedule. Bring me petitions. Bring me repaired dams. Bring me a price of bread that doesn't change when a singer leaves town. Eamon's temper was better than John had expected. He bowed, sincere enough to be notable, and took his leave with the kind of grace that ruins men when the world fails to reciprocate. Outside, banners moved like good cloth in a good wind. The captains watched with narrow, bored eyes. John watched their eyes, not their banners, and saw politics retreat where coin had begun to learn it was safer. They did not fight. They unspooled in front of each other like 2 kites launched on the same day from neighboring hills. Eamon rallied 3 keeps and lost a 4th because the steward there had learned to like the feeling of squares drawn straight on a page. John lost a charter to a clever speech and gained it back with salt paid and open books. On a day that was so fine it seemed ill-bred, they stood on opposite banks of a ford and watched farmers bring their cows through the shallows. Eamon bowed across the water. John lifted a hand. The cows shook themselves and were uninterested in royalty. In the end, stories tire. The Golden Company grew bored with a myth that did not raid anything large enough to satisfy their ledgers. Their quartermaster's wife in Old Town found that the registry error had been corrected by a woman in a plain gown with a clean pen. Eamon's best writer caught a fever and wrote poems that made boys cry about bread. The lords who had pledged insult discovered that roads built with fair wages make their daughters safer. One by one, in embarrassment more than defeat, the pretender's props folded. He was not a bad man. He was a man sent the wrong year. He came to John a second time without drums, with only 2 friends who looked at the floor and said, "If I swear to your numbers, will you give me something to do that will make me more than a ghost with a seal? I will send you where men have been told their names don't matter," John said, "where ledgers are lies and truth is counted in broken teeth. If you stay 3 winters and your hands are blistered and your sleep is good, you can come back and we will talk about thrones." He sent Eamon to the neck with a stack of saws and a foreman who had never heard of dragon lords. The young man went. He did not come back in 3 winters. He wrote letters that smelled of pine pitch and rain and asked hard questions about culverts. John read those letters at the same table where he laid his crown, sometimes like a napkin. Blackfyre hung to one side, an argument that made talk calm. He brought in children to ink ledgers when their hands were small and their eyes were good. He paid them. He sent them home before sundown. He brought in old men who had been told their usefulness had gone when their strength had and found their minds could carry just as much as ever. He let the small wrongs pile and then cut them like knots. He let the small rights sing and did not take credit for their tune. Once, on a rain day that made soup taste like memory, Sansa came with a retinue that fit inside a single room because she had learned that the size of a shadow is not proof of the man who casts it. They ate stew with too much time and laughed about it and then looked at maps until their eyes hurt. She examined Blackfyre with the same quiet appraisal she gave men in council. "I hated this name," she said, as if confessing a childish sin. "It has been used too often to pull wolves by the tail. Now it seems like a broom." "Brooms keep houses," John said, "and get broken by boys," she said, but her smile was fond. "How many boys do we have to break before they learn to sweep?" "As few as we can make it," he said. They walked in the rain to the counting house and let the damp lay their hair down like children's. Men bowed without bowing, the way men do when they are happy to see that the person who orders them around likes the same misery they do. They watched a woman from Cracklaw point at a column and sigh in satisfaction. They watched a boy from the Crownlands finish his figures and punch the air and blush when he saw them watching. Sansa squeezed Jon's hand once, lightly, and let go so that he would not have to notice it for too long. At the wall, the old pass opened and opened again like a mouth trying to remember a word. Ranging parties returned with stories about a cold that lay like a quilt and then lifted like a knife. Jon sent them thicker cloaks and stouter boots and a barrel of pickled onions because no one should only taste salt. He rode there himself when he could, not to remind them of the old war but to remind himself that edges exist. He stood on the parapet with a cup of hot cider that had more tart than sweet and watched the world lie white and patient. Ghost put his head under Jon's hand as if he had been waiting to complete a circle. The boy with the careful hand asked questions about schedules as if schedules could stop storms. Jon answered them because sometimes the speaking is a shelter. He burned a letter once. Came on a good hawk with a poor heart. The seal was nondescript, which is a kind of declaration of intent. It offered him a trade. A secret about his birth that would ruin a woman's name and raise his above the roofline of every hall, in exchange for one harbor's freedoms to be returned to men who had grown used to calling theft by another name. He took the letter into the godswood planted in a square in the capital. Young trees, their leaves unsure yet of how to shade properly. He read it twice, then fed it to a brazier the street sweepers used to warm their hands. The ashes made no more of a mark than a sparrow's bath. He told no one. He went back to his ledger and underlined a date because dates are truer than blood. In the work of Winters, Gendry married and did not close his forge. Davos's hair went whiter and his back went more obstinate. Lady Eleonora took 3 wives for 3 reasons and ran her hayfields like a monastery. Eamon wrote from the neck that he could not believe how much moss had to be coaxed into leaving stone alone and asked whether a certain proverb about patience was true. Jon wrote back that proverbs lie unless you make them honest. Arya appeared and vanished like a whitened breath in cold air, left gifts made by hands no one had seen, and once curled up on a bench in Jon's workroom and fell asleep with her cheek on her fist like a girl in a stable. Jon laid a blanket over her and sat very still until the sun moved to an acceptable angle and then went back to his papers without letting joy knock over the ink. There were duels because men loved them. He allowed 2 and forbade 9, and the 2 that were allowed were between men who had hearts quick enough to stop when told and not enough to go when dared. There were riots. He weighted them like a slow stream, and when he had to draw the sword he did it as if he were uncoiling a rope to pull men out, not to bind them down. There were betrayals. He took them as weather and built gutters. There were triumphs. He kept the banners from being too clean. When the first gray hair in his beard would not be plucked because more stood behind it ready to take the place, he took a morning and walked to the house where the crown hung on its peg. He took it down and weighed it in his hands. It had not grown heavier or lighter. He set it on the table. He sat. He wrote a letter to a boy he had hired against tradition and found sturdier than his cousins. He named 3 women whose hands he would trust with ships and quarrels. He wrote the word regency and crossed it out, then wrote stewardship and underlined it twice. He drew the sword and laid it next to the crown and looked at both until they stopped pretending to be anything but tools. Then he went to work again because that is how endings are earned. On a night when the sky was so clear you could hear stars tick, he dreamed, though he had tried to train himself not to. In the dream, the maître of the drowned archive sat on a ledger like a captain on a barrel and flicked the corner of a page until it made a small sound that might have been laughter. "You were heavy enough," he said to Jon with satisfaction. "Not with pride, with patience. I have waited for that kind of weight longer than is flattering to admit." "It was not only me," Jon said. He did not like dreams. They are dishonest when they flatter. It was roads and women and men and bread and wolves. The maître nodded as if all that were obvious. Swords are nothing but letters written with metal. Men read them as they want to. You made your sword write smaller words more often. That was new. That was sufficient. Jon woke to the sound of bread being sliced in a kitchen too far away to smell. He rose and washed and went to stand where the early workers passed. He let them see him. He let himself see them. He put his hand to Blackfyre's hilt once without drawing, like touching a door before you open it. Then he opened the door and stepped into the day. There were still enemies. One does not tidy a realm into gentleness. A captain on the Trident who fancied himself a prince of mud tried to tax the river with pikes and nearly drowned in the nets used to hoist him. A guild in the capital decided to set prices secretly and learned to their chagrin that secrecy cannot be done in rooms with holes in the shutters and girls with ears. A village on the Dornish marches declared itself a free state and informed its goats that no one could tell them what to do. The goats were unimpressed. Jon sent letters, sent men, went himself when he had to, and allowed himself, once, to be rude in the way men remember in order to teach hesitations that will reduce the need for rudeness later. He aged into the crown rather than out of it. His hands stayed steady. His temper learned not to go where it used to. It took longer paths and arrived with fewer flames. Blackfyre developed a nick visible only in a certain light, and he did not have it ground out. He kept it as a reminder that even careful men cut wrong sometimes. He let boys hold the sword where their fathers could see, so that the fathers would learn to trust their sons with steel before real steel found them. He let old foes retire without speeches so that they could plant beans. When, at last, a sickness came through the streets that coughed and loved lungs and left weak folk weaker or not at all, he did not look for an enemy he could behead. He looked for linens and nurses, and men to dig in the right places with respect. He stood on the steps of a house for the poor with his hair damp from yet another wash and told a dozen lies that were almost true, that it would be all right, that they would see spring, that they were not alone. He told a dozen truths that were harder and liked him less, that he would not be able to save them all, that the numbers meant some people would go hungry to keep others alive, that he would not let the rich buy a separate river to drink from. Blackfyre hung at his hip and felt like a friend who comes anyway even if there's no tavern in it for him. When the sickness left, it did not leave a speech behind it. It left fewer hands and more work. He set to it. He did not mourn loudly. He mourned exactly as loudly as the woman who scrubbed the steps nearby and meant to finish before the sun. He ate an apple and did not taste it and then tasted the next one to prove he still knew how. In time, there were grandchildren of men he had hired when he was young. In time, there were roads that had no memory of the holes they had once accommodated. In time, songs got worse because prosperity makes lazy poets, and then better when hungry boys began to write angry words about fairness that changed into something else as they grew careful. In time, people forgot what the name Blackfyre had once meant and knew it instead only as a sword that hung on a wall when not needed and came down when men were idiots. In time, the crown fit differently, as all hats do when hair thins and foreheads learn more. When he felt the first true tiredness. The kind that comes not from work but from the sense that you have learned your particular share of it and must now make room for people who will be inattentive in new and useful ways. He took a ride to the Godswood in the capital and sat. The heart tree there was young, and its face had been carved by a slow hand that had not known how deeply to cut sorrow into laughter. He liked it for that uncertainty. He drew the sword and laid it across his knees. "You and I have done enough," he said. "Others will do the rest. They will do it worse and sometimes better. I will not stand in their way because my stories are tidy." He returned to his workroom and took the crown from its peg and set it on the table. He wrote his last list and underlined the words that would confuse the next man most kindly. He asked 3 women to come and stand at the corners of the table as guardians of his poorer decisions. He asked Davos to stand in the doorway and ask every man who came in a question about ships that would reveal whether the man had ever seen one. He asked Gendry to hammer 3 nails into the door at shoulder height and to tell any boy who asked that they were there to hold wet cloaks so that no one would slip. He stood. He spoke. He handed the iron to a hand he trusted, not because it was noble, but because it was clean. He kept Blackfyre. He walked that evening into a city that had learned to be less interesting. He listened to market haggles and was pleased when they ended without curses. He watched a dog steal a fish and a fishmonger pretend not to see because the dog belonged to a girl whose father had died in the sickness. He bought a heel of bread and ate it leaning against a post as if he were nobody, because he had never been anyone else and found no dishonor in the comfort of that. Sometimes, men stopped him and asked to see the sword. He showed them. He let them touch the hilt. He let them see their faces in the blade and watched them flinch or not. He told them when they asked the name. It was a bad name, he would say. We made it better. That is all kingship is. That is all baking is. That is all road mending is. Names and heat and patience. And hands. Ghost appeared sometimes at his knee and looked bored with everything but the sun. Arya's feather inside his shirt was a small, private scratch. Sansa's letters became less frequent and more content. Short lists of apples harvested and wolves sighted. Small quibbles with neighbors settled without banners. A letter from the neck carried the smell of rot and progress and said only, "We have learned what moss will and will not do. That is enough for a season." On a day as ordinary as porridge, under a sky that had chosen a sensible blue, Jon Snow sat at a table, oiled a sword, and wiped the oil off with the care of a man who has learned to love his work because it is work. He hung the blade where he could see it. He went to the doorway and looked out. The city breathed. Somewhere, someone began another song that would be argued with by numbers and made better by time. He smiled and stepped down into his street, which was the only throne he had ever wanted.